The desert air was a physical weight, a thick, shimmering blanket of heat that pressed down on my old Wrangler. Nevada in late spring was a relentless beast, and the further we drove from the familiar asphalt arteries of civilization, the more it felt like we were being swallowed. For what felt like an eternity, the landscape had been a monotonous canvas of cracked earth, hardy creosote bushes, and the distant, hazy smudges of mountains that never seemed to get any closer. There was nothing out here. No signs, no fences, no contrails in the vast, bleached blue sky. Just us, the rattling of the Jeep, and the growing irritation of James in the back seat. "This is a bust, Charles," he grumbled, for at least the 10th time. Some dude with a dozen followers on a ghost account played you. We're burning gas to stare at more nothing. James had always been the pragmatist of our group, the anchor that kept Charles's more eccentric impulses from dragging us completely adrift. Charles, however, was impervious. He sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a strange, almost zealous light in his eyes. He was the quiet, enigmatic core of our trio, the one who always unearthed the forgotten corners of our world. His methods were a mystery. He'd just appear with a new location, a grainy photo, a whispered rumor. This time, it was a screenshot from a profoundly sketchy Instagram account, blurry pictures of dark holes in the ground, cryptic comments, and a caption that read, "Dozens of abandoned mineshafts in the Mojave Desert if you know where to look." Charles claimed he'd been in contact, that some anonymous figure had given him a general area to explore. That was all it took. He was instantly, irrevocably obsessed. "Just a little further," Charles insisted, his voice calm but firm, a stark contrast to James's simmering frustration. He was stubborn when it came to navigation, a trait that had led us to some of our most memorable finds and a few dead ends. I decided to indulge him a little longer. The hum of the engine, a familiar comfort in the oppressive silence, just as my own patience began to fray. As the sun dipped lower and painted the desert in hues of orange and bruised purple, James shot upright. "Hey, what's that?" He pointed a finger off to the right. At first it was just a distortion in the heat haze, another jumble of rock and sand. But as I steered the Wrangler closer, bumping over the uneven terrain, a structure resolved itself from the landscape. It was a half-collapsed wooden moor built into the side of a rocky slope, the timbers bleached and splintered by decades of sun and wind. Part of the entrance was caved in, a chaotic pile of rock and rotted wood, but behind it, a perfect, profound darkness gaped. It was undeniably a mineshaft. A slow, satisfied smile spread across Charles's face. Without a word, he pulled out his phone, opened the offline map he'd meticulously downloaded, and dropped a pin. He then turned to James, a single, triumphant phrase hanging in the air. "Told you." James just muttered something about dumb luck, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of excitement. Against all odds, Charles had led us to the needle in a haystack of desolate wasteland. I parked the Jeep on a relatively flat patch of dirt a safe distance away. We climbed out, the sudden silence of the engine amplifying the vast emptiness around us. We pulled on our gear-sturdy boots, headlamps, and the dust masks Charles had thoughtfully brought. Up close, the mine was even more intimidating. The wood looked impossibly fragile, the darkness within absolute. Charles, ever the methodical one, picked up a fist-sized rock and tossed it into the abyss. We held our breath. A beat of silence, then clang, a pause. Clang, another pause, clang, then nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the implication of its depth. "Trip on the way down," Charles said, his voice muffled by his mask, "and you're probably dead." The descent was treacherous. It wasn't a vertical drop, but a steep, gravelly slope that threatened to send us sliding with every step. The ground was a loose scree of rock and dirt, and ancient, moss-slicked wooden beams lined the walls, offering dubious support. The air changed almost immediately, the oppressive desert heat giving way to a damp, subterranean chill that clung to our clothes and raised goosebumps on our arms. The light from the entrance dwindled rapidly, a shrinking, misshapen eye that finally winked shut, plunging us into a world illuminated only by the narrow, bouncing beams of our headlamps. After what seemed like an age of careful, shuffling descent, the shaft leveled out. We found ourselves at the bottom, in a wider cavern where the main tunnel branched off in several directions. It was a scene straight from a history book. Rusted, half-buried minecart rails snaked along the floor, and skeletal support beams stood like silent sentinels every few yards. A thick, velvety layer of dust coated every surface, muffling sound, and dulling colors to a uniform gray. The air was stale, thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else, something metallic and faintly unpleasant. The masks were a godsend. We chose a tunnel at random and began to walk, our footsteps the only sound in the profound quiet. Our headlamps cut cones of light through the darkness, revealing more of the same decay and emptiness. Scraps of corroded metal and splintered wood littered the ground, the sad remnants of forgotten labor. The place felt picked clean, stripped of any tools or artifacts of value long ago. We were just walking through a tomb, the initial thrill of discovery slowly being replaced by a creeping sense of an anti-ICLIMAX dot, and then we heard it. It was faint at first, a subtle rhythmic sound from somewhere deep down the tunnel ahead. A soft shish-scrape. I froze, my eyes darting to Charles. He had stopped too, his head cocked, listening. I saw his silhouette turn towards James, who immediately understood and motioned for us to kill our lights. We clicked them off, in unison, plunging ourselves into an absolute, disorienting blackness, the kind of dark that feels heavy, that presses in on your eyes. We stood there, utterly still, our breathing seeming unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a dragging sound, metal on rock, wood on dirt. It was impossible to tell with the strange, disembodied acoustics of the tunnel. The echoes distorted it, making it seem both far away and unsettlingly close. But one thing was certain, it was getting nearer. Scrape, drag, slow, deliberate, and inexorable. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive quiet. I could feel the cold sweat prickling my neck. Who else could possibly be down here? Another explorer. A squatter. The rational explanations felt hollow, flimsy shields against the primal fear that was beginning to take root. We stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Time had lost all meaning. The scraping just kept coming, a slow, torturous crescendo of suspense. Then, a sudden sharp click. James's flashlight flickered, on for a split second, a brilliant, blinding flash of white that illuminated a short stretch of empty tunnel before he plunged us back into darkness. It was a fatal mistake. The dragging sound stopped instantly. The silence that fell in its wake was 100 times more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. Then, from the depths of the tunnel, came a deafening, metallic clang, a sound of finality, as if whatever was being dragged had been violently dropped, and immediately following it, a sound that shattered the very fabric of the silence, a sound that will be seared into my memory until the day I die. It was a scream, but to call it a scream feels inadequate. It was a raw, guttural, demonic shriek, of pure, unadulterated rage and agony. It was long, drawn out, and vibrated through the very rock around us. It was a sound that was barely, if at all, human. We didn't need to communicate. We didn't hesitate. We turned and we ran. Pure adrenaline, flight, all thoughts of caution, of the treacherous ground, were gone. We scrambled. We stumbled. We sprinted through the suffocating darkness, our own panicked gasps and the frantic pounding of our feet echoing chaotically around us. I could hear something else, too. Footsteps. Heavy, rapid footsteps thudding on the dirt floor somewhere behind me. They were keeping pace. The thought that I was about to be overtaken, to feel a hand or something worse close around my ankle, sent a wave of pure panic through me. I was in the back, struggling to keep up with the bobbing lights of Charles and James ahead, and then I tripped. My foot caught on a rogue piece of metal rail, and I went down hard. One of my sneakers was ripped clean off my foot. I scrambled back up, a searing pain shooting through my now bare foot, but I didn't have time to go back for the shoe. I just kept running, the sharp rocks and splintered wood on the floor tearing into my sock and skin. Up ahead, Charles and James had reached the base of the steep incline and were already clawing their way up. I threw myself at the slope, my hands and bare foot finding purchase on the loose gravel. The climb out was an excruciating agony. Every upward step on my injured foot was a fresh wave of blinding pain. I could feel splinters, dozens of them, embedding themselves deep into my flesh. If it hadn't been for the sheer, mortal terror propelling me forward, the belief that the screaming thing was right behind me, I don't think I could have made it. I finally burst out of the mineshaft, gasping, into the cool, clean air of the desert night. My foot was a mangled, bloody mess. Charles and James had to practically carry me, half dragging me across the rocky ground to the jeep. I couldn't drive. James leaped into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. I had barely slammed my door shut before he threw the Wrangler into gear and floored it, fishtailing in the loose dirt before finding traction. We didn't see anything emerge from the mine, no shadowy figure in our rearview mirror, but we weren't taking any chances. We drove in stunned, terrified silence all the way to the nearest town, the only sounds the rattling of the jeep and my own pained groans. The emergency room was a surreal island of sterile light and calm efficiency after the subterranean horror we had just escaped. I got a tetanus shot, and a weary-eyed nurse spent what felt like hours painstakingly cleaning my wounds and tweezing out countless splinters. I couldn't put any weight on my foot for days. A week later, once I could hobble around without wincing, at every step, James delivered some bad news. He'd dropped his wallet somewhere near the mine entrance, probably while helping me to the car. He was hesitant, but the prospect of replacing his ID, credit cards, and everything else was daunting. He suggested we go back just to the entrance. No way in hell are we going back inside, he swore, and we all fervently agreed so. With a heavy sense of dread, the three of us drove back out into that vast, empty wilderness, following the pin Charles had saved. Mine entrance looked just as sinister in the daylight. James's wallet was nowhere to be found, but we did find something else there. Sitting a few feet from the dark opening was my shoe. I approached it cautiously, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I bent down and picked it up. It was shredded. The thick rubber sole was torn, and the canvas upper was ripped to pieces. But the most horrifying part, the detail that made my blood run cold, was the marks. Deeply impressed into the mangled remains of my sneaker were what could only be described as teeth marks, not the clean, sharp bites of a coyote or a dog. These were huge, uneven, and powerful. Entire chunks of the shoe were simply gone, bitten clean away. We stared at it, the silence between us thick with unspoken questions. We didn't stick around much longer. As we drove away, leaving the gaping black mouth of the mine behind us for the last time, we tried to rationalize it. A homeless person, as James suggested, driven mad by isolation. But what would they eat? How could anyone survive down there for so long in that cold, barren darkness? The questions circled in my mind, unanswered and unanswerable. Charles D. the creepy Instagram account again, telling them what happened. He never got a response. It's going to be a very, very long time before I go exploring in the desert again. Some forgotten places, I've learned, are forgotten for a reason, and some things that dwell in the dark are better left undisturbed. The desert held a different kind of silence. It wasn't the muffled, life-filled quiet of the forests I knew, but a vast, profound emptiness that seemed to absorb sound. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat, the soft rustle of your own clothes. For a rugged, outdoors-loving guy like me, it was a new frontier, an experience I had to conquer. My girlfriend, Tiki, shared that same thirst for the untamed. It was one of the first things that drew me to her 6 months ago, her eyes lighting up not at the prospect of a 5-star resort, but at the mention of a campfire under an open sky. So, we had decided to do something different. We'd tackled mountains, canoed across serene lakes, and hiked through dense woods. But the desert, with its stark, silent beauty, was an untouched page in our book of adventures. The main draw, the one that sealed the deal, was the promise of the stars. We were both hopeless romantics when it came to the night sky. Many of our early dates had consisted of driving my truck out past the town's light pollution, lying on the hood, and just watching the cosmos wheel above us. So when I found a spot online, a remote, legally permissible campsite with no amenities save for a few scattered fire rings and the promise of a celestial panorama, untainted by city glow, it sounded like paradise. We packed the truck with our well-worn gear and set off early on a Friday morning. The 3-hour drive was a gradual shedding of civilization. Paved roads gave way to gravel, which in turn dissolved into a rugged dirt track that felt like it was leading us to the end of the world. There were no houses, no fences, no other signs of human life for the last hour. That profound isolation, it was exactly what we were craving. By the time we arrived at the designated area, a wide, flat expanse dotted with scorched circles of rock, the sun was already beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes. As I had hoped, the place was utterly deserted. We were alone with the sand, the sky, and the silence. The first 2 nights were pure bliss. The days were hot and lazy, spent reading and exploring the immediate, alien landscape of wind-sculpted rock formations and hardy spidery vegetation. The nights were cool and magical. We'd build a crackling fire in one of the stone rings, share a couple of beers, pass a small joint back and forth, and talk for hours about everything and nothing. Sometimes we'd just fall silent, leaning back in our camp chairs, our faces tilted towards the heavens, utterly mesmerized by the sheer density of stars. A glittering diamond dust spilled across black velvet. Later, we'd retreat to the tent, the thrill of our seclusion adding a raw, intimate charge to our moments together. It was perfect. We were disconnected, untethered, and completely absorbed in each other and the vastness around us. But both nights, we heard something strange. It was a sound that didn't belong. It came from far out in the distance, a low, drawn-out cry that was difficult to place. It sounded like a howl, but it had a mournful, almost human quality to it, like a prolonged, agonized moan. It wasn't the sharp yipping of a coyote. The first time we heard it, we both paused, our eyes meeting over the flickering flames of the campfire. "Did you hear that?" Tiki whispered, her brow furrowed. I nodded slowly. We tried to laugh it off. A trip took to the unfamiliar desert wildlife. Probably a mountain lion, I offered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Or some weird desert fox, she agreed, but the sound had left a small, unsettling ripple in the perfect tranquility of our night. The second night, it came again, around the same time, that same haunting, lonely cry echoing across the immense, dark expanse. We acknowledged it with a shared glance, a silent agreement to dismiss it, to not let it spoil our trip. It was just the desert, we told ourselves. It had its own strange, wild voice. On the third night, I was jolted from a deep sleep by a sound that was not distant, not an echo. It was right outside the tent. Crunch, crunch. The soft, deliberate sound of footsteps on the dry, gravelly dirt. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. My first thought was an animal, a deer or a javelina maybe. But the steps were too slow, too measured. too bipedal. It wasn't the four-footed scuffle of a creature of the wild. This was a person. I lay there, frozen in the darkness, my heart beginning to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to move, to reach for the heavy maglite I kept by my sleeping bag, to wake Tiki, to call out, but I was paralyzed by a primal, instinctual fear. The footsteps didn't circle the tent as I expected they might. They simply stopped a few feet from the side where I was lying. And then there was only silence. A heavy, pregnant silence that was infinitely more terrifying than the footsteps had been. I stared up at the thin fabric of the tent ceiling, straining my ears, waiting for another sound, another movement, but there was nothing. Whoever was out there was just standing, watching, waiting. The thought sent a cold dread seeping into my bones. I must have lain there for what felt like an hour. Every nerve endings screaming, praying for the footsteps to resume, to walk away, to release me from this agonizing suspense. Then, a new sound cut through the silence, a sharp, unmistakable flick. The sound of a lighter. A small dancing orange glow appeared through the thin nylon wall of the tent. It was about waist high, just a few feet away. A tiny, malevolent star. In the suffocating darkness, I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the flame held steady for a few seconds, then began to move, waving slowly back and forth in a lazy, deliberate arc. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. A lost camper, a prankster. But the deliberate, almost ritualistic movement of the flame felt deeply sinister. I remained motionless, barely daring to breathe, my eyes locked on that wavering point of light. Then, the flame bloomed. It expanded with a soft whoosh, transforming from a tiny flicker to a bright, angry glow. They had lit something larger, a piece of cloth, perhaps, or a branch, a torch. Before I could even fully register the implication, the glowing object was dropped. I heard it hit the dirt with a dull thump, and a split second later, the entire side of our tent erupted in a sheet of brilliant, terrifying light. The heat was instantaneous and ferocious. It slammed through the thin fabric, a wave of blistering intensity that felt like opening an oven door. Within seconds, the nylon began to sizzle and melt, and the fire started to spread with an unnatural speed. That searing heat is what finally shattered my paralysis. "Tiki, wake up, fire," I yelled, shaking her roughly. She woke with a startled cry, her eyes widening in panic as she saw the flickering orange inferno consuming the wall of our temporary home. There was no time to think, no time for fear. We were pure adrenaline and instinct. We scrambled frantically, grabbing armfuls of our belongings, sleeping bags, clothes, backpacks, and tossing them out of the tent's other entrance, away from the flames. I don't even know if we got everything. Our only thought was to get out. We burst out of the tent into the cool night air, the roaring fire at our backs. The scene was surreal. Half of our tent was a blazing pyre, casting wild, dancing shadows across the desert floor. Tiki, thinking fast, grabbed one of our large water jugs and started dousing the flames, while I frantically stomped on the spreading patches of burning grass and bush around the main blaze. Working together in a desperate, panicked frenzy, we managed to get it under control, beating the last of the flames into smoking, blackened submission. The acrid smell of burnt plastic and scorched earth filled the air. Half of our tent was a melted, ruined husk. As Tiki stood catching her breath, her face smudged with soot and illuminated by the dying embers. I grabbed the maglite and swept its powerful beam across the area, my knuckles white as I gripped the cold metal. I scanned the darkness, searching for the person, the monster, who had just tried to burn us alive. But there was nothing. No one. Just a vast, silent, and now deeply menacing desert. "We have to go now," Tiki said, her voice shaking but firm. We didn't need any more convincing. We began grabbing our salvaged gear, not even bothering to pack it properly, just stuffing it into bags. We started speedwalking, almost running, in what we prayed was the direction of the truck. But in the disorienting darkness, with no fire to orient us and no landmarks to guide us, every direction looked the same. Panic began to set in as, after several minutes of stumbling through the dark, we realized we were lost, turned around. In the vast featureless expanse it was then that I heard it again. That same distant, horrifying scream from the previous nights, only this time it didn't stop. It was a continuous, agonized wail, like an animal caught in a trap. And then, another one started up, from a different direction. And then a third. They were all coming from somewhere behind us, from the direction of our ruined camp, a chorus of inhuman agony that seemed to be echoing our own terror. It was clear now that it wasn't one thing out there. There were more. I didn't say a word. I just grabbed Tiki's arm, my grip tight, and pulled her along, forcing us to move faster, our feet sinking into the soft sand. We were running on pure fear, the terrible screams chasing us through the darkness. By some absolute miracle, we stumbled upon the truck, its familiar shape, a beacon of hope in the terrifying night. We threw our gear into the bed with a clatter, and scrambled into the cab. I fumbled the key into the ignition, my hands trembling so violently it took 2 tries. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear, peeling away from that cursed spot as fast as I dared. The drive That was a nightmare. The dirt road was treacherous, and with only my high beams to cut through the inky blackness, every dip and turn felt like it could send us flipping over into the abyss. I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes wide, glancing frantically at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see figures silhouetted against the horizon. Tikki sat beside me, silent, her arms wrapped around herself. I could see the tears tracking paths through the soot on her cheeks. I wanted to comfort her, to say something, anything. But my throat was tight with fear. We finally hit the main road, the smooth, solid asphalt under my tires, the most reassuring feeling I've ever had. I didn't slow down, didn't stop pushing the speed limit until we saw the welcome glow of other headlights, the familiar sign of civilization. Later, from the safety of a brightly lit gas station, we called the police and reported everything. They took our statement, but their tone was one of wary skepticism. An arsonist in the middle of nowhere. It sounded crazy, even to us. All I can think about now, playing the night over and over in my head, is the sound of those footsteps, the flicker of that lighter. If I hadn't been such a light sleeper, if I hadn't woken up at that exact moment, Tikki and I would have been trapped. We would have been murdered in our sleep, incinerated in the middle of the desert, our screams swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence, just another mystery for the dunes to keep. There are parts of my mother's life that are like a map with entire continents left blank. I've always been aware of these empty spaces, these carefully guarded territories of her past. Suspicious isn't quite the right word for how I feel about it. It's more like a persistent, low-grade curiosity, a sense that the woman I know is only part of a much larger, more complex story. She was born in Mexico, in a border town she never names, and came to the United States alone for college. That's the official story, the clean, simple narrative she presents. She met my dad, built a career, a life, a family, and never looked back. The rest is silence. Any attempt to chart those unknown lands is met with expert deflection. She'll answer a direct question about her childhood with a wry joke, a sudden pivot to a completely different topic, or a warm, disarming smile that is also a conversational dead end. Growing up, my dad explained it as a kind of trauma response. Some things are better left buried, son, he'd say. And for a long time, I accepted that. It made sense. Why would I want to cause her pain by digging up old ghosts? But as I got older, my curiosity began to outweigh my deference. I started to notice the sheer skill involved in her evasiveness. It was an art form. At family gatherings, inquisitive aunts or uncles would be gently but firmly steered away from the topic of her upbringing with a grace that was almost breathtaking. I've only managed to collect a few scattered, cryptic fragments over the years. I know her town was somewhere along the Texas border, a place with a notoriously rough reputation. I also know about a recurring joke she used to tell when I was a kid. She'd laugh and say her father's side of the family were the politicians, and her mother's side were the crooks, but she could never tell which was which. I used to laugh along, thinking it was just a cynical jab at the state of politics. Now, I wonder if it was a literal truth, thinly veiled in humor. Her father, she once let slip, worked for the government in some vague capacity. About her mother, there is nothing, not a single story, not a name, not even a photograph. It is a complete and total void. The only other piece of the puzzle I have is a name. I will call him R. One night, when I was about 10, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I padded down the hallway, I heard my mom's voice coming from the darkened living room. She was speaking softly, in Spanish, a language I've regrettably never learned, but I didn't need to understand the words to recognize the name she repeated. Several times the cadence of her speech wasn't conversational, not like she was talking to him, but about him. The living room was completely dark, and a childish fear of the shadows made me instinctively reach out and flip the light switch. She didn't startle or cry out. It was as if she had been expecting me. She simply ended the call, her face illuminated by the sudden, harsh light, and fixed me with a glare I had never seen before and have never seen since. It was cold, hard, and utterly unfamiliar. "Go back to bed," she commanded, her voice dangerously quiet. I fled without a word. And that's it. That is the sum total of my knowledge about my mother's life before America, a cynical joke, a vague occupation, and a whispered name in a dark room. Almost a year ago, an event occurred that took these scattered fragments and slammed them into a terrifying new context. I'm from Arizona, and having graduated from college the year before, I was on a long, mind-numbing road trip to visit an old friend. I was deep in the desert, the highway a ribbon of black asphalt stretching through an endless expanse of saguaros and sun-baked earth. I'd exhausted my playlists and, not being a podcast guy, I started cycling through my phone contacts, looking for someone to break the monotony. Eventually, I called my mom. We fell into an easy, familiar conversation about soccer. We're both fanatics, and we could talk for hours about Champions League matchups and player transfers. Her knowledge of the sport is encyclopedic, and the debate was a welcome distraction from the hypnotic emptiness of the landscape. It was in the middle of a passionate defense of her favorite team that I saw them. Two big, dusty pickup trucks were parked sideways, completely blocking the road ahead. It didn't look like an accident. There were no flashing lights, no signs of distress. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Worried someone might need help, I slowed my car as I approached. I was still on the phone with my mom, but I hadn't mentioned what was happening yet. I brought my car to a stop a safe distance away, wondering what to do next. Before I could make a decision, the doors of the trucks flew open and 3 men jumped out. All of them were holding guns. My blood ran cold. In my rearview mirror, I saw another car approaching rapidly from behind, boxing me in. I was unarmed, outmanned, and in the middle of nowhere. Compliance was my only option. One of the men, his face grim and weather-beaten, walked to my driver's side door and tapped the window with the barrel of his rifle. The message was clear. The other 2 stood back, guns held at a low ready, their eyes scanning the surroundings. I raised my hand slowly, palms open, and pushed the door open, getting out of the car. By now, the car behind me had stopped, completing the trap. The man barked a series of commands at me in rapid-fire Spanish. The words were meaningless to me, a torrent of sound I couldn't decipher. In that moment, my lifelong failure to learn my mother's native tongue felt like a fatal character flaw. I wanted to die of shame and fear. But I didn't need a translator to understand their intent. Within moments, they had relieved me of my wallet, my phone, and my keys. They were methodical, efficient, and unnervingly calm. It looked like I was about to be left stranded in the desert, a ghost story waiting to happen. Then, one of the men got into the driver's seat of my car, which was still running. My conversation with my mom still active on the infotainment screen's Bluetooth connection. That's when everything changed. I watched through my own car window. As the man reached a finger towards the end call button on the screen, he hesitated. His finger hovered for a second before pulling back. He tilted his head, a look of confusion on his face. He was listening. He was listening to my mom. A jolt went through me as the pieces clicked into place. My mom must have realized something was wrong, that I had gone silent, and she must have been talking, trying to figure out what was happening. I watched, transfixed, as the man's lips began to move. He was speaking into the car's microphone, having a full-blown conversation with my mother in Spanish. The windows were up so I couldn't hear a word, but I saw his gestures, the way he nodded, and I swear on my life, I saw him repeat the name R, shaping the letter with his lips as if he was confirming it, making sure he had heard her correctly. The other 2 men must have noticed the strange turn of events, because they abandoned their guard posts and walked over to my car. The man inside rolled down the window, never taking his eyes off me as he spoke to his companions. After he finished, all 3 of them turned and stared at me, a long, silent appraisal, as if they were seeing me for the first time, reevaluating me based on this new information. The conversation didn't last much longer. The man in my car hung up the phone. He got out, and the 3 of them walked back over to me. Wordlessly, they handed me back my phone. They handed me back my keys. They handed me my wallet. They had taken all the cash from it, but everything else was there. The man who had been in my car looked me in the eye, a strange, almost respectful smile touching his lips. "Tax," he said, in a thick, heavy accent. "I have never been so happy to be robbed in my entire life." I fumbled my way back into my car, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. All 3 of their vehicles, including the one that had blocked me from behind, turned and drove off the highway, kicking up plumes of dust as they disappeared into the open desert. I tried to memorize their license plates, but none of the vehicles had any. After a few minutes of driving, once the initial shock began to recede, I called my mother back. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What did you say to them?" She was calm. She told me she had simply threatened to call the police, that she was tracking my location on her phone and knew exactly where I was. "That's bullshit, Mom, and you know it," I said, my voice rising. "What did you really talk about?" She stuck to her story, her voice firm, insisting that she had just pleaded with them, that the Spanish was just her begging them to let me go. I didn't believe a word of it, but what could I do? Arguing with her was like punching water. I asked her to call the police for me, and she said she would. We ended the call, and I drove the rest of the way in a state of profound, unnerving silence. For a long time I tried to block the experience out, to file it away as a freak occurrence, a lucky escape, but I can't. The memory keeps coming back, clearer and more disturbing each time. I am becoming more and more certain that my mother's past isn't just something she's running from. It's something that is still very much alive. I believe she has, or had, a significant connection to a Mexican gang or cartel. And the most terrifying thought is that maybe that connection didn't end when she crossed the border. Maybe it just went dormant. She knows I'm not a kid anymore. She knows I saw what happened, that her flimsy explanation doesn't hold up. I don't know how much longer she thinks she can maintain this charade. I feel like I need to confront her, to demand the truth, once and for all. But I'm afraid of what that truth might be, of the tension it would create in our family. And worse, I'm afraid of what kind of world I might be inviting into my own life if she finally decides to tell me everything. A world where a name, whispered over the phone, can be the difference between life and death on a lonely desert road.